So if I haven't had the opportunity to meet you yet, my name is Juliette, and I work here. I job share with my husband, Ben, who's also ordained, but he's with our little girl this morning. I want to talk this morning about being a community that worships with all that we have. So if I was to ask you, what is worship? How would you finish this sentence? Worship is... How would you finish that sentence? Worship is... Anyone got any ideas? Worship is...
Praising God.
Praising God. Anyone else got any ideas? Worship is... Anyone else want to offer their ideas? Just Joel. Well done, mate. So worship is where we show adoration, which means where we show deep love. And so we saw the video of the story of Jesus at Simon's house. Now, there would have been, Simon was like a religious leader of the day. So the lunch at his house was probably quite good, like probably not just your standard bring and share quiche. Like it was probably quite decent, maybe a roast dinner or something like that. And there would have been other important people there. Now, I grew up in Norfolk, and my husband is a Londoner, and he was horrified to discover when we were dating that we never locked our house. Like, we just didn't lock it unless we went away on holiday, basically. Well, it seems as if Simon didn't get the memo about locking his door either. And so there's this lady that comes into his house whilst Jesus is round for dinner, a little bit embarrassing, I should think. And basically, this lady, she starts weeping at Jesus' feet and drying her tears with her hair. Like, that's odd. Anyone dried their tears with their own hair before? No, really odd, I think. But not only that, she started pouring perfume over Jesus' feet. Now, perfume in those days was really, really expensive. It was probably like a whole year worth of wages to pay for that perfume. And she just poured it on someone's feet. Like, there are better uses for perfume than somebody's feet. But that's what she did. It was an extravagant expression. Like, it was like an over-the-top expression of love for Jesus. She risked loads doing that. First of all, she just blew a whole year's wages on some liquid on someone's feet. But she risked rejection. She was known for not being sort of the best person in society. She risked being rejected. She risked humiliation. She risked being cast out. But she went for it because Jesus was there. And she poured everything she had out in this one moment that we read about in the gospel, like this one over-the-top expression of worship. I just want to talk for one moment about another woman who adored Jesus. We've spoken about her already this morning, the Queen. Queen Elizabeth II has been in the news a lot this week because she sadly passed away on Thursday. But we don't hear about the Queen's life, about a particular extravagant expression of worship. But over and over again, I have been amazed in the last few days to read stories and accounts of how the Queen loved Jesus. She pointed to him. Every Christmas message that I've ever heard in my lifetime has always pointed to Jesus as the person to worship. She said about how the teaching of Jesus has been her guide and her hope. She faithfully worshipped Jesus all her life. And we see in numerous moments where she gives speeches and the way that people who knew her really well account for those interactions with her, we just see continually that she pointed to Jesus as the person that she loved, the person that she worshipped. So this morning I want to ask, how do we build a life of worship so that we get to a place where we worship with all that we have? So we're thinking about food, and one of my favorite things, don't know about you, but one of my favorite foods are sweets. I have a real sweet tooth. Has anyone ever had one of these pick and mix tubs before? Anyone ever had one of these? So when I was growing up, we used to have a Woolworths in our town, and it had the biggest section. There's a lot of love for Woolworths here. It had the biggest section of pick and mix I've ever seen in my whole life. So I had to go to Tesco yesterday to get this pick and mix. And I was filling it up with Smarties at the end, and they just overflowed everywhere. And like all these adults walking past me were like, "What on earth is she doing?" It's just sweets. It's great. But it's one of my favorite things. And what I learned in Woolworths as a child was that the best way to make the most out of these pots is to put the big sweets in first, then the medium sweets, and then the little sweets. And you even do like a little shake to make the little sweets go down as you put some more in at the end. It's the way to like maximize your pocket money that you've just like put it all into sweets. So we're going to think this morning just about some of the things we might put in place to build a life of worship. Now, you won't be able to see inside that tub. So I've got a little glass jar here, which hopefully you could see a little bit better. Sorry, it's not huge because I wasn't going to spend hundreds of pounds on sweets yesterday. So it's not as big as I'd like it to be. But what you do when you're stood in front of the pick and mix is you look for the jelly snakes first. Well, there weren't any yesterday in Tesco, so I had to go with the next biggest thing, which were these horrible, like sugar, really, really tangy, sour, sugary things. So you put the big things in first. So I'm going to put a few of these really big, sour sweets in here. You've got to pack them down. They've got to go in really, like, tightly at the bottom. And I wondered what you thought were some of the really important big things that we could put in place to worship God. So sometimes I think maybe these things might happen once a week or maybe at 1 or 2 points in the year. What are some big things that you could put in place to worship God? Anyone got any? Oh, it's just gone very dark. What are your ideas? What are some of the big things we could put in place? I don't mind if you're a little person or a slightly more grown-up person. What are some big things we can put in place to worship God, that help us worship God? Reading the Bible. Very good. Anyone else got any ideas? Praying, yeah. Going to church, yeah. Listening to God. These are some really good ideas. So I wondered if maybe the most important thing, like the really core foundational thing that we can do is say yes to Jesus. When we said yes to Jesus, that's saying, God, we're putting you first. Other important things, so some other big sweets we might put in. Sorry, I am using my fingers, so if anyone does want to eat these sweets at the end, my hands are quite clean. The next big things, I've got some big strawberries in there. I love these ones. These are my favorite, probably. And some huge, like, fried egg mix. But some big things that we might put in place that help us worship God are going to church, maybe going to a youth weekend away, or maybe somewhere like Focus in the summer where we get to gather with more Christians and worship God. Some other big things we might do is we might tithe our money. That means we might give 10% of our money to God right at the beginning of the month, maybe. We might read about God in the Bible. And lots of these things involve a community of believers. That's us, the church. They involve other Christians supporting and encouraging you because we learn to worship God best when we worship together. And one of the things that we're getting to do later as a community is we get to say over Esme's Thanksgiving that we're going to encourage you as a whole church to worship God. We're going to get around you and support you and encourage you in your life with God. So we've got some large sweets in. So we're now on to the medium sweets. So what are some of the smaller things that we might do to worship God? Some of these things, I think, might happen on a more regular basis. Maybe not necessarily every day, but maybe in smaller groups of people. Some of these things might happen every day. So has anyone got any ideas of things that you might do maybe in a smaller group of people or maybe every day to worship God? Yeah, Ruben. Putting on and listening to worship music. Yeah. Saying prayers before dinner. Anyone else got any ideas? Yeah. maybe praying before bedtime. So there are some things that we can do in smaller groups of people that help us to worship God. Like we might join a midweek group. Maybe you pray as a household, maybe before your meals or maybe before bedtime. You might serve on a team. We've got so many amazing people that serve on team here. But it might be a way in which you can worship God. You might support Love Your Neighbor. You might be really generous with your hospitality. You might notice that somebody maybe isn't feeling like themselves this week, and you might invite them around for lunch. You might be generous with your money. Maybe some unexpected finances come into your account. We're all praying for that right now, I am sure. But that might happen, and if that happens, is your first thought to give it to God? We might be generous with our time. We're all busy, whether we're young or old. We all have lots to do and people to see. But we might be generous with our time, generous with the time we spend with God, generous with the time we spend with those who need us. We might do a Bible reading every day. We might follow a devotion book. There's an amazing book at the moment that we're encouraging everyone to read at church, which is called Meals with Jesus. And it's just got some really helpful family devotions in there. And I just really encourage you, if you've not looked into that book, maybe just have a chat with myself or Jim. We'd love to encourage you and just show you a bit more about that. So lots of those midweek things, I'm just going to put some sort of more medium sweets in. Lots of those midweek things, they happen out of an overflow of gathering as church together. And they help us in these spaces that are a little bit smaller with a few less people to go deeper. So worship is an expression of deep love. So the more we create space to go deeper, the more in love with Jesus we'll fall. And the more in love we become with Jesus, the more we'll worship him. So now on to some tiny sweets that you use to shake down your pot at the end. I wonder what the tiny things might look like in your life. I think for all of us, they might look different. But the overflow of expressions of worship become uncontainable the more we fall in love with Jesus. We might remember to thank God for a little thing that he did during the day that otherwise it might be quite easy to forget. We might offer something that we love or enjoy doing to God as an expression of worship. I used to, when I was a young person, I used to play football, and I used to play for Norwich City, which is the best team in the world. I'm so sorry for any Lincoln fans. But when I played football, before a game, it was the thing I loved most. It's what I enjoyed doing the most. And what I decided to do before a game is I would just pray, and I'd say, God, I love playing football. I love you, and so I want to worship you by playing this sport. And that's all I'd pray. And so there might be something that you love doing that you could use as an expression of worship towards God. You might see something pretty in creation, and instead of saying, isn't that sunset beautiful, you might say, thank you, God, for your creation. This sunset is stunning. You might make time to spend with God even when you're really busy. In fact, I'd say when you're really busy, make time to spend with God. It might mean getting up earlier, which if you have small children isn't the funnest thing in the world. It might mean having a shorter lunch break so you can spend time with Jesus. It might mean that remembering just before you go to bed, instead of watching that last little YouTube video, instead you spent time with Jesus. And so these little expressions of worship, they begin to overflow in our life. And eventually what happens is that we begin to recognize God in everything, and our worship for him overflows. What actually happens, rather than this illustration where it's all fallen out the sides, is that the more that we worship God, the more space we have created in our lives to worship him. We sort of like expand. Our ability to worship sort of expands. So sometimes it might look like extravagant worship, like over-the-top worship, like the woman in the story today. Sometimes our worship might look like faithfully worshiping God over a long period of time, in the good and in the bad, just like Queen Elizabeth. No matter what our worship looks like, I don't think anyone has ever regretted choosing to build a life of worship that means that we begin to worship with all that we have.